Chapter 3. Apples and Trees. The trees in the hidden grove had not grown in 7 years. Rowan stood at the center of the clearing, his chest heaving, sweat pouring down his face in rivulets that carved paths through dust and the dried blood of a dozen previous sessions. Around him, the forest was a graveyard of splintered trunks and uprooted stumps. 3 ancient oaks, each wide enough to house a family, lay shattered like matchsticks. The earth itself had been torn into craters and furrows, the soil turned to black mud by forces that had no business existing in a place that should have been peaceful. Zen stood at the edge of the clearing, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. She had not moved from that spot in the hour it took for Rowan to exhaust himself 6 times over. A faint shimmer of warding magic haloed her form, absorbing the stray kinetic pulses that still rippled through the air, like the aftershocks of an earthquake. "Again," she said. Rowan gritted his teeth and pushed himself upright. At 16, he had outgrown the lean, boyish frame of his younger years. His shoulders had thickened, his chest broadened, and he now stood a full head taller than Wyatt, whose presence he could feel pacing restlessly at the perimeter of the clearing where their mother had confined him to watch. Rowan's muscles shifted beneath his skin, the faintest glow of diffused mana pulsing in time with his heartbeat. A Tier 2 knight. The mana moved through him instinctively now, no longer a conscious effort, hardening his frame, amplifying his strength to that of 15 men. He could feel it coiling in his legs, ready to launch him forward. Zen moved first. She did not shout. She did not telegraph. One moment she was standing still, the next, a wall of compressed air erupted from her position, hitting Rowan like a siege ram. He crossed his arms to absorb the impact, his diffusion flaring automatically, but the force drove him backward through the mud, his boots carving twin trenches in the earth. Before he could recover, Zen was upon him, her hands weaving through the air as she summoned arcs of lightning that crackled between them, forcing him to move. Rowan exploded sideways, his speed and agility on full display. He closed the distance in 3 strides, his fist cocked back, the air around it compressing with the density of his mana. Zen's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. She raised both hands, and a hexagonal barrier of interlocking mana threads materialized between them. Rowan's fist connected with a sound like thunder. The barrier fractured in a spiderweb of luminous lines but held. The shockwave of the impact blew outward, shearing the remaining bark from 3 standing trees and sending tremors through the ground that Wyatt, watching from the perimeter, had to brace against with his own personal ward. "Your aim is true," Zen said, her voice calm, even as her barrier dissolved into motes of light. "But you telegraph your left shoulder before you strike." "Wyatt, what did you see?" Wyatt, who had been crouched on a fallen log with his knees drawn to his chest, straightened immediately. At 14, he had grown lanky and tall, his frame lean but corded, with the quiet tension of a mage whose power was still expanding. "Your left shoulder drops 3 inches before a right cross. It's a micro-tremor in the mana flow. You can't suppress it yet." Zen nodded. "Good. Again." Rowan groaned but pushed himself upright. He had learned not to argue with that tone. Wyatt watched his brother's sessions with the intense focus that had always defined him. Where Rowan's training was a display of raw, overwhelming force, Wyatt's was a study in precision and control. When it was his turn, Zen led him to a different part of the clearing, a relatively intact circle of earth, marked by faint chalk lines that had been redrawn 100 times. "Perception first," Zen said, standing at the far edge of the circle. "Tell me what you see." Wyatt closed his eyes. The world shifted. He felt the ambient mana in the air like a river of silver threads, the subtle pressure changes in the earth, the hum of Gaia's ley lines running deep beneath them. He could taste the ozone of his mother's lingering wards, the residual heat of Rowan's kinetic strikes, the cool dampness of the soil. You're holding 4 wards simultaneously, 1 around your core, reinforcing your mana core. 2 on the periphery, ready to intercept. 1 as a trap, loose, waiting for me to trigger it. Zen smiled. Open your eyes. Wyatt opened his eyes and immediately threw his hands forward, his fingers splaying into a complex sigil. A kinetic pulse launched from his palms, but he was already weaving a second pattern with his other hand, a shield expanding around his body. He was moving from perception to action, in a single breath, his mind calculating trajectories, mana density, and timing faster than most apprentices could manage in a minute. He was upper apprentice, close to crossing into unitary. His internal core was expanding, and the simultaneous casting was becoming less of a strain. The kinetic pulse hit Zen's peripheral ward and scattered. Zen's trap ward activated, snapping shut around Wyatt's position like a mana noose. But Wyatt had anticipated it. He recycled the ambient energy from his spent pulse, pulling it back into himself, and shattered the noose from within with a concentrated burst of earth mana that cracked the ground outward in a radial pattern. Zen stepped back, impressed despite herself. You recycled your output. That's new. I've been practicing, Wyatt said, breathing hard but grinning. Good, because your mother is about to stop going easy on you. Gran's voice came from behind them, deep and steady as always. Wyatt and Rowan both turned. Gran was walking toward them, his massive frame moving with a silent grace that belied his size. He carried a wooden staff in one hand, and his expression was the same one he wore before a hunt, focused, calm, dangerous. The worst sessions were when both parents came at them at once. Rowan and Wyatt stood back to back in the center of what remained of the clearing, the air thick with the smell of ozone and crushed vegetation. Gran occupied one flank, Zen the other. The trees around them had been reduced to stumps and splinters. The ground was a craterscape. They were fighting with everything they had, and it was not enough. Gran moved first, closing the distance with terrifying speed for a man of his size. His staff cracked through the air, not aiming for Rowan directly, but for the ground between them, sending a kinetic wave that forced Wyatt to leap. Zen's lightning followed, a crackling net that filled the space Wyatt had just occupied. Wyatt twisted in midair, his ward flaring, but the combined force of the lightning and the shockwave pushed him off course. Rowan caught him, slamming him into the earth with a roll that saved Wyatt from taking the full impact. They came up in a crouch, and Rowan charged Gran, his fist wreathed in compressed mana. Gran met him halfway, the staff connecting with Rowan's forearm with a sound like a hammer on an anvil. The force drove Rowan to one knee, his diffusion screaming as it absorbed the impact. He could feel his bones straining. Wyatt didn't hesitate. He threw both hands forward, his fingers tracing a rapid sequence of sigils in the air. A wall of earth erupted from the ground between Gran and Rowan, but Gran's staff struck it, and the kinetic force travelled through the earth, forcing Wyatt to redistribute the energy through his own ward. The recoil knocked him backward. His mother targeted him instantly, her hands weaving a binding spell that lashed out like whips of compressed air. Wyatt twisted, his ward absorbing the worst of it, but the force spun him around. He came face to face with Zen's open palm, and she stopped it an inch from his chest. Enough, she said. They collapsed. Rowan and Wyatt both fell to their knees, gasping, their bodies trembling from the exertion. Gran lowered his staff, his breathing steady, his expression grim. You're getting faster, Gran said, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had fought wars and knew the difference between effort and true power. But you're still fighting as 2 separate entities. Against coordinated opponents, that gets you killed. Rowan wiped blood from a cut on his lip and looked up. We held out longer this time. You did, their mother agreed, her voice softer. She knelt beside Wyatt, placing a hand on his shoulder. Her touch glowed faintly with restorative mana, easing the ache in his muscles and the strain on his core. But you would have lost against a real enemy. Enemies don't attack alone. The battlefield doesn't care how fast you are if you're not together. Wyatt nodded slowly, his mind already replaying the session, analyzing every mistake, every missed opportunity. He could feel his core humming, nearly full, so close to the threshold of unitary that he could almost taste it. The expansion was coming. He could feel it in his bones, in the way his mana responded to his will with less and less resistance. Rowan pushed himself to his feet and offered a hand to Wyatt. His brother took it, and together they stood, battered but unbroken, looking at the destruction they had wrought in their parents' presence. "Same time tomorrow?" Rowan asked. The hunting expeditions began the following week, and Gran took them separately at first, teaching them to read the woods the way he had spent years mastering. Rowan accompanied Gran on the first hunt, tracking a mana-infused wolf that had been raiding the eastern pastures. The beast was large, its fur crackling with arcs of lightning that arced between its shoulders like a living storm. It moved with unnatural speed, a blur of feral power where it left tracks scorched into the earth. Gran moved ahead, silent and deliberate, reading the signs. Broken branches at shoulder height, the smell of ozone cutting through the forest floor, the disturbed earth where the beast had dug in before a strike. Rowan followed, his senses expanded by his diffused mana. He could feel the residual lightning energy in the air, a faint tingling against his skin. He pulled his own mana inward, hardening his frame, letting it sink into his legs and core. His boots made no sound on the forest floor. "Stay behind me," Gran murmured without looking back. "When it moves, you move. Don't try to outthink it. React." The wolf found them first. It exploded from the tree line 50 yards out, a streak of lightning and muscle, its eyes glowing with mana-infused fury. Gran stepped forward, drawing his sword in one motion, but the wolf's speed was inhuman. It closed the distance in a single bound, claws leading, lightning crackling along its forelegs. Rowan moved before he thought. He launched forward, his diffusion flaring, and met the wolf halfway. The impact drove him backward, his boots carving through the soil, but his stance held. He absorbed the kinetic force through his hardened frame, his muscles and bones acting as living armor. He countered with a palm strike to the wolf's chest, channeling his diffused mana outward in a concentrated burst. The wolf flew backward, crashing through a thicket of saplings, but was already rising, lightning arcing more violently around its body. "Again!" Gran barked. "Don't let it recover." Rowan charged. The wolf leapt again, faster this time, and Rowan met it in the air, his body twisting to absorb the impact on his forearms. He felt the lightning course through his diffused mana, stinging against his hardened skin but not penetrating. He drove his knee into the wolf's jaw and followed with a strike to the temple, his fist carrying the force of 15 men. The wolf went down hard, and Gran's blade finished it in a single, clean motion. Rowan exhaled, his body trembling with adrenaline. It was faster than the last one. "Faster," Gran agreed, wiping his blade on the grass. "But not smarter. Beasts react. Some can coordinate." Wyatt hunted with Zen, and the experience was entirely different. They tracked a mana-infused boar that had been demolishing the western fence lines, its hide infused with earth mana that made it nearly impervious to ordinary weapons. The boar moved with the weight of a siege engine, each step cracking the ground, its tusks gleaming with mineral deposits. Zen taught Wyatt to read the mana signatures. The earth mana in its hide is dense. You can't pierce it directly. You need to disrupt the flow, create a gap, and strike there. Wyatt closed his eyes and extended his perception outward. He felt the boar's mana signature like a heavy, slow pulse in the earth, a deep thrumming that resonated through the soil. He could see the weave of earth mana around the boar's body, a dense, interlocking pattern that would deflect most attacks. "I see it," Wyatt said. "There's a node behind the left shoulder, where the mana concentration is weakest. If I can hit that—" His mother nodded. "Then you break the weave. But you'll need to cast fast. The boar won't give you time." They found the boar in a clearing, rooting through the earth with devastating power. Zen sent a distraction spell first, a burst of lightning that arced across the clearing, drawing the boar's attention. As it turned, Wyatt was already weaving, his fingers moving in a rapid sequence, his mind calculating mana density, trajectory, and timing in fractions of a second. He threw both hands forward. A kinetic pulse launched from his palms, but he was also weaving a secondary ward around himself, anticipating the boar's charge. The pulse struck the boar's weak point, disrupting the earth mana weave for a fraction of a second. The boar roared and charged. Wyatt's ward flared as the boar hit him, the earth mana impact driving him backward through the air. He landed hard, rolling to absorb the impact, and immediately began weaving again. This time it was a binding spell, mana threads lashing out to entangle the boar's legs. The boar stumbled, and Zen's finishing spell, a concentrated bolt of lightning, drove into the exposed node behind its shoulder. Wyatt lay on the ground, his chest heaving, his ward dissolving into motes of light. He could feel his core humming, pushing harder against the boundaries of his current capacity. He could feel it again. His mana core was close to another expansion. His mother knelt beside him. "You're close, Wyatt. So close." The mission that changed everything began as a routine patrol. A village 2 miles northeast reported a wolf raiding their sheep pens. 3 sheep killed in 2 nights, dragged into the woods with no trace left behind. Gran and Zen debated it for 10 minutes before agreeing to let their sons handle it alone. "Single wolf," Gran said. "Fast, maybe mana infused. But single. You've trained for this." Zen added her own conditions. "Stay together. If it's too much, retreat and call for us. No pride." Rowan and Wyatt set out at dawn, tracking the wolf into the foothills. The wolf was fast, its trail leading them through dense forest and across rocky terrain. But they were faster, their training serving them well. Rowan led with his senses expanded by diffused mana, reading the ground and the air. Wyatt followed, his perception extended outward, tracking the residual mana signatures the wolf left behind. They found the wolf's pack at dusk. The clearing they entered was a slaughterhouse. 15 or more wolves lay dead, their bodies torn apart with brutal efficiency, mana-infused blood pooling in the earth. And among the corpses, a group of goblins stood in a ragged circle, their crude weapons dripping with gore. 20 goblins, coordinated, organized. Rowan and Wyatt froze at the edge of the clearing, their training kicking in even as their minds struggled to process what they were seeing. Goblins were not supposed to be like this. Goblins were something they only heard about in stories. Goblins here was not how it worked. But the goblins were here. They moved with purpose, their formations tight, their commands sharp and guttural. They had killed the wolves, and they were now standing guard over their kill. The goblins saw them. A war cry erupted from the group, and they charged. Rowan and Wyatt moved instinctively, falling into a back-to-back stance. The first goblin lunged at Rowan, its crude blade swinging in a wide arc. Rowan deflected it with his forearm, his diffusion absorbing the impact, and drove a punch into the goblin's chest that sent it flying backward. 2 more came at Wyatt, their weapons crossing in a coordinated strike. Wyatt's ward flared, absorbing the first blow, and he countered with a kinetic push that sent both goblins stumbling. But there were too many. The goblins kept coming, their attacks coordinated, flanking, overwhelming. Rowan took a blade to the shoulder, the force driving him to one knee. Wyatt caught a goblin's strike on his ward, but was pushed back, his footing lost. They were losing. Then Rowan looked at Wyatt, and Wyatt looked at Rowan, and something clicked. "Left flank!" Rowan yelled. Wyatt didn't hesitate. He threw both hands to the left, weaving a binding spell that lashed out in a wide arc, ensnaring 6 goblins and yanking them off their feet. Rowan charged through the gap, his body a wrecking ball of diffused force, clearing the left flank in 3 strides. "Right side," Wyatt shouted. Sir Rowan pivoted, and together they moved as one unit. Wyatt wove wards and kinetic pulses, creating space and disrupting formations. Rowan closed the distance and dismantled goblins with precise, devastating strikes. They communicated without words, reading each other's movements, covering each other's blind spots, fighting as the 2 halves of a whole. It took 5 minutes. When it was over, 20 goblins lay dead among the wolves, and Rowan and Wyatt stood in the center of the clearing, breathing hard, covered in blood that was not entirely theirs. Rowan's shoulder was bleeding from a deep cut, but it was nothing serious. Wyatt's ward had held, and his core was still full, pushing harder against the boundaries of his capacity with every spell he cast. Wyatt looked at the carnage around him and felt a chill run down his spine. These goblins had not just hunted for food, they had hunted with strategy. They had killed an entire wolf pack that was mana-infused, faster and stronger than any individual beast. And as Wyatt's eyes swept over the bodies, his mage perception caught something else. The faint, lingering glow of hardened mana cores within the goblins' chests. Valuable. Precious. The kind of resource that could accelerate his own progress if he could just reach the threshold of unitary to harvest them properly. Gran found them at the edge of the clearing walking back to the house, his expression shifting from relief to alarm as he took in their injuries and the state of their clothes. Then Wyatt told him about the goblin pack, their coordination, their numbers. Gran's face went still, the stillness of a man who has just recognized the shape of a storm. He took off immediately, tracking northeast, and did not return for 6 hours. When he did, his face was grim, his eyes hard. "There are signs everywhere," he said, his voice low. "Goblin tracks, orc footprints, campsites, carved territory markers. The surrounding area is being encroached on. A large band, goblins and orcs together. They've moved into the foothills northeast of the village." The village committee convened that night. By morning, a request for mercenary assistance had been sent to the city of Nolan, the nearest with a mercenary guild. 3 days later, the first mercenaries arrived. They rode into Willow's Hollow at dusk, their armor scarred, their weapons worn, their eyes carrying the hardened look of men who had seen too much war. Gran watched them from the ridge, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, his expression unreadable. Rowan and Wyatt stood beside him, and for the first time, Rowan noticed the tension in his father's frame, the way his mana pulsed with a quiet, dangerous readiness. "What happens now?" Rowan asked. Gran didn't answer right away. He watched the mercenaries make camp in the village square, their fires glowing in the twilight, their voices carrying on the wind. "Now," Gran said at last, "we see if they're worth the gold." Behind him, in the house, Zen was packing supplies. She could feel Wyatt's core pushing against its boundaries, the expansion imminent. She could feel the mana in the earth shifting, the subtle tremors of something large and dangerous moving through the foothills. The apples on the trees were unripe, green and hard, but winter was coming, and with it, the hunger that drove men and monsters alike to desperation. Foss. Chapter 4. No better time than now. The village committee's meeting hall was a long, low building of timber and packed earth, its smoke-stained rafters carrying the scent of old wood smoke and damp wool. It had hosted harvest festivals, wedding celebrations, and the occasional dispute settled over tankards of ale. Today it hosted something Willow's Hollow had never seen before. Gran felt the weight of eyes on him, as he walked through the doorway with Zen beside him, Rowan and Wyatt trailing a step behind. The room held nearly 24 mercenaries, hardened men and women in worn leather and steel, their scarred faces and calloused hands marking them as people who carried their work on their skin. They filled the space like a storm front had rolled in and decided to rest. Rowan's instincts prickled at the perimeter of his awareness. Even without pushing his perception outward, he could sense something about these people that set them apart from the traders and travelers who occasionally passed through Willow's Hollow. It was subtle, a density to their presence, a coiled quality that made the air around them feel different, like standing near a forge that had just gone cold but still radiated residual heat. Wyatt's arm brushed against his, and Rowan glanced down to see his brother's eyes wide, taking in the scene with that familiar combination of wonder and analysis. Zen's fingers found Gran's for a brief moment, just a squeeze, just enough to say, "This is the world we've been preparing them for." The village elder, a thin man named Corwin, with a voice that carried well despite his frame, rose to address the room. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice. As you know, our scouts have confirmed a large orc and goblin band moving into the foothills northeast of Willow's Hollow. We've requested your assistance in removing this threat before it reaches our fields and homes." Gran and Zen took seats at the long table near the front. The boys stood behind them, shoulders squared, trying to look like they belonged there, even though everything about this room told them they did not. 3 mercenaries rose to join Gran and Zen at the table. The first was a broad-shouldered man with dark hair and a barrel chest, who introduced himself as William, the mercenary company's vice leader. He had a ready smile that reached his eyes and a handshake that tested Gran's grip with an easy, practiced confidence. Will was a knight. Rowan could feel it immediately. The density of presence he'd sensed from the man had a core to it, a focused point of power that reminded Rowan of his father, but something was off about it. The energy felt compressed, concentrated in ways Gran's didn't. The other 2 were company commanders, a woman named Mara, with a scar running from temple to jaw, and a stockier man called Torin, whose arms were crossed and whose eyes never stopped moving. Gran laid out what his scouting had revealed: the size of the orc and goblin band, the carved territory markers, the pattern of their movement. Will listened with the attention of a man who'd spent years reading terrain and tracking prey. When Gran finished, Will nodded slowly. "Coordinated movement," Will said. "These aren't raiding parties. They've established territory, and they're holding it. If they decide Willow's Hollow is worth taking, they'll come with a plan, not just hunger." Mara leaned forward. "How many total?" Gran estimated. "Large enough that sending a warning is pointless. They've moved too far and dug in too deep." Torin grunted. 6 days. We need 6 days to get the rest of the company here and fully prepared. 7 more fighters are 2 days out from the Eastern Road. The rest are further, 4 days, maybe 5. Will looked around the table. "Once we're at full strength, we hit them hard and fast. Surprise is our advantage. They may know a mercenary company is coming, but they don't know when or where we'll strike first." Gran studied the map the elder had spread across the table, his finger tracing the route from Willow's Hollow to the foothills. "We approach from the eastern ridge. The goblin and orc scouts will be looking west, toward the village. They won't expect pressure from the high ground." Zen's voice cut in, calm, but carrying the weight of someone who'd commanded on battlefields these people had never seen. "The terrain between the ridge and their camp is broken ground. Ravines, scattered boulders, thick brush. It favors stealth over force. If we can get to the edge of their camp before dawn, we catch them in disarray." Mara's scar stretched as she smiled. "Now you're talking." The planning continued for nearly an hour. Discussions of formation, timing, supply, and contingency. Rowan and Wyatt stood behind their parents, absorbing every word. The mercenaries spoke in a language of tactics and experience that was entirely new to them. They used terms like flank security, reserve rotation, overwatch positions, concepts that had names but no frameworks in Rowan and Wyatt's minds yet. But beneath the tactical discussion, Rowan kept feeling it, the subtle otherness of these warriors compared to his parents. They were powerful, undeniably so, but their power felt like individual notes, each distinct and separate. His parents' power had always felt like a chord, harmonized, resonant, greater than the sum of its parts. When the meeting finally broke, the mercenaries filed out in small groups, their voices dropping to low conversations as they dispersed to make camp on the village outskirts. Will lingered behind, turning to face the family with that easy smile still in place. "Gran," Will said, extending a hand toward the boys. "These must be the sons I've heard whispered about." "I'm Will." Rowan stepped forward first, shaking the man's hand with the firm grip Gran had drilled into him since childhood. Wyatt followed, offering a small nod and a quiet, "Wyatt." Will's eyebrows rose almost imperceptibly at Wyatt's composure, and his smile widened. He glanced at Gran, then back at the boys. "You've trained them well." It wasn't a question. Gran returned the look, then gestured toward the door. "Walk with us." They stepped out into the afternoon light. The village of Willow's Hollow stretched around them, modest cottages, fenced gardens, smoke rising from chimneys, the sound of children playing in the distance. Peaceful, fragile. Will fell into step beside Gran, his boots heavy on the packed earth. The boys walked a few paces behind, their minds racing. "So," Will said, his voice casual but his eyes sharp, "what do you think of me, boys?" Rowan blinked, caught off guard by the question. He glanced at Wyatt, who looked equally uncertain. After a moment, Rowan settled on honesty. "You seem like a good night." Will chuckled. "Good start. Anyone else?" Wyatt, ever observant, spoke up. "You must like wearing leather armor. It looks well used but carefully maintained." Will's laugh was loud and genuine. "Sharp eyes, little one. Very sharp." He slowed his pace to match the boys, his expression turning thoughtful. "You know, I can feel it in you both. The training's there, but the foundation is something special." He glanced at Gran and Zen with a head nod that carried genuine respect, then turned and headed back. Gran and Zen exchanged a look, then Gran stopped walking and turned to face the boys. "What did you feel, Rowan, when you were in that room with them?" Rowan frowned, searching for the words. They felt different, not weaker, just different. Their power felt separate from each other, like individual notes instead of a chord. "Like a chord," Zen finished softly. She knelt to be at the boy's eye level. "What your father and I want you to understand is that knights and mages can specialize once they reach a certain level. Your father is what we call a force weaver, the most common path for advanced knights. He projects his mana outward as kinetic force, amplifying his strikes at range." Zen stood and paced a few steps, her hands moving as she spoke, but specialization branches from there. "Will, for instance, look at him again, Rowan. Really look." Rowan focused, pushing his perception outward the way Gran had taught him. He felt Will's presence, back with his mercenary group, then next, a shift in his own awareness. The density was there, but it was concentrated differently than Gran's. It wasn't spread through his frame the way Gran's mana diffused evenly across his body. Will's power was compressed, focused inward, like a spring coiled tight. "Speed," Rowan said slowly. "He specializes in speed over power." "Exactly," Zen said, "and likely stealth over defense. You can feel the compression, because his mana is tuned for quick bursts and rapid recovery, not sustained output. That's a specialization path available to knights at his level. Wyatt's eyes were wide with fascination. And the mages? Zen smiled. One of Will's mercenaries may be specializing in trap magic, precasting spells with timed or triggered activation. Another might be focused on formation magic, conjuring smokescreens, fog, or other obscuring effects over an area. These are paths that become available as your magical core expands. They're not common in Willow's Hollow. The boys exchanged excited glances. Rowan felt his chest swell with the thrill of new knowledge, of a map expanding in his mind. Gran took a deep breath. The casual warmth drained from his face, replaced by the measured gravity of a man who'd made decisions that shaped lives. "Boys," he said, and both Rowan and Wyatt straightened instinctively. "I believe it is now time to move on to the next level of training." He walked slowly between them, his hands resting on their shoulders. "You have lived your entire lives in Willow's Hollow. It is a safe place, quiet, friendly. But as you felt today from those mercenaries, this world is vast and dangerous. That is precisely why your mother and I have taught and trained you from the earliest age. We have seen this world, not all of it, not even a small portion of it. But what we have seen, from the largest cities to the smallest villages, to the kingdoms and the battlefield. We know the dangers we've witnessed. And there are far more dangers yet unseen." Zen stepped forward, taking Wyatt's hand in hers. "We know you will eventually want to leave this small place. That is why we have prepared you. You are both farther along than we were at your age, without question. But as your father says, dangers beyond what you can imagine are everywhere. This is not to scare you or make you cower. It is to warn you to always be prepared. There are also many wonders in this world, along with the dangers. Both exist. Both are real." The boys looked at each other, their earlier excitement tempered into something deeper, understanding, and the beginning of something like resolve. Gran moved behind them, wrapping an arm around each of his sons, pulling them close in a gesture that was both protective and equal. His voice dropped, steady and certain. "No better time than now, boys. Tomorrow we begin your weapon training." The blacksmith shop occupied the corner of the village square, its stone walls blackened by decades of fires, its single window fogged with the perpetual haze of the forge. The rhythmic clang of hammer on steel greeted them as they approached, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. Gran walked ahead, his stride measured. Appropriately enough, or so rumor has it, this village's blacksmith used to be a well-known weapons maker from a barony or perhaps a duchy out west. He settled here after a dispute with the local lord. Gran's voice carried the flat tone of someone relaying information he didn't entirely endorse. "It's all speculation by the locals. I'm only telling you because you'll hear it eventually, and it's better to hear it from me than whispered in a tavern. Do not speak of it in front of Forge Master Shannon." Wyatt nodded without asking what he should or shouldn't say. He was learning the pattern. Some information was given not to inform, but to prepare. "Address him as Forge Master," Gran continued. "You're still young. Respect opens doors that age alone cannot." The shop's interior was a maze of tools and half-finished work, swords hanging from pegs, horseshoes stacked in corners, a large anvil at the center that looked like it had been hammered flat and raised again more times than either boy could count. Behind the anvil stood Shannon, the blacksmith. He was nearly Gran's height but broader in the arms, his forearms thick with corded muscle and crisscrossed with old burns and cuts. His hair was brown-grey, the colour of ash on hot iron, and his face carried the weathered look of a man who'd spent his life leaning into fire. Gran stepped forward. "Forge Master Shannon, I come with a request for my sons." Shannon turned, his dark eyes assessing the boys in a single sweep that took in their posture, their stance, the way they carried themselves. He grunted once, approval, or at least acknowledgement. "All right, Boys, show me what you've got. Rowan didn't hesitate. He stepped into the open space near the anvil and ran through a series of motions: punches, kicks, elbows, the fluid transition between offense and defense. That Gran had drilled into him until it was instinct. His movements were powerful, precise, carrying the weight of years of practice. Shannon watched silently, then turned and made scribbles on a scrap of paper with a piece of charcoal. Wyatt followed, and his demonstration was entirely different. He didn't throw punches or kick. Instead, he moved through a series of defensive postures, warding gestures, the flow of mana through his hands, the quick shifts between offensive and defensive stances that Zen had taught him. His movements were economical, every gesture serving a dual purpose, every shift of weight calculated. When Wyatt finished, Shannon grunted again and made more notes. Then he gestured for them to follow him into the back workshop. The workshop was a cavern of weapons, hanging from walls, stacked on shelves, leaning against pillars. Shannon moved through the space with the certainty of a man who knew exactly where everything was, pulling weapons from racks and shelves, piling them into his arms with practiced efficiency. He carried the armful back to the main floor and dumped them onto the large work table with a clatter that made the boys wince. Then he began separating them with swift, decisive movements. "All right," he said, wiping his hands on a leather apron. "I have what you'll need for starters." He pointed at Rowan with a calloused finger. "For you, a great sword for when you need destruction, a long sword and short sword for precision, and the dance of death. A spear for mastery of the battlefield." He paused, then turned to Wyatt with a wink. "For you, a short sword to trace the mana flow, and twin daggers. Because daggers are cool. You'll know what to do with them in short order." Gran stood silently through the entire selection, his expression unreadable. But when Shannon finished, Gran's eyes widened almost imperceptibly, and he gave a single nod of amazement. The blacksmith had reached the same conclusions Gran had in his own mind about what each boy needed. 3 days before the departure, the training grove, hidden by Zen's warding magic, its trees reduced to stumps, and its ground a craterscape from years of intense sessions, became a classroom. Gran stood before his sons, his wooden staff resting against his shoulder, as he explained the basics of each weapon. For Rowan, he started with the great sword, its weight, its reach, the way it demanded commitment to every swing. Then he moved to the long sword and short sword combination, demonstrating the fluid transitions between wide arcs and precise thrusts. Finally, the spear, its extended range, its deceptive versatility, as both a thrusting and hooking weapon. For Wyatt, Gran covered the short sword's attack and defense, and the twin dagger's dual purpose, close quarters efficiency, and the ability to strike multiple weak points in rapid succession. Zen explained the weapon's role in mana tracing, how a blade could extend perception the way his hands extended his wards. "Starting today," Gran said, "you will learn to wrap mana around each of these weapons." The boys exchanged glances. Mana wrapping was a new concept entirely. Rowan had diffused mana through his body until it was as natural as breathing. Wyatt had pulled ambient mana into his core and projected it outward in spells and wards. But wrapping mana around an external object, giving the weapon the same connection he had to his own body, was uncharted territory. Gran stepped back. "Try. Figure out what works for you. I won't ask the impossible, and I won't coddle you through the possible. Both are lessons." Rowan settled on the great sword first. He lifted its weight, feeling the balance point, the way it demanded to be held with both hands, and swung with the body's full power. He pushed mana into the blade the same way he diffused it through his arms, consciously, deliberately. The mana resisted. It wasn't refusal so much as a fundamental mismatch. His mana flowed outward from his core, through his arms, into his hands. But when it reached the steel, It slid off the surface like water on oiled leather. He adjusted his focus, tried to channel it differently, to push it into the metal rather than through his body toward it. Still, nothing. The blade remained inert in his grip, just steel, heavy and unresponsive. Wyatt tried with his short sword and encountered the same wall. His mana perception could trace the flow of ambient energy through the air, could identify weak points in mana weaves, could recycle spent spells back into his core. But wrapping that mana round a blade, his mana slipped past the steel the way his fingers slipped through water. They tried again, and again, and again. Zen and Gran watched from the edge of the grove, their expressions unreadable. Rowan caught his mother's eye once and saw patience there. Not impatience, not frustration, just the steady patience of someone who knew that struggle itself was instruction. 2 days before departure, the boys were still making little progress. Rowan's great sword felt like a stranger in his hands, heavier than it should have been, disconnected from his body in a way that made every swing feel clumsy. Wyatt's short sword was no better. His twin daggers sat abandoned in their sheath, and even trying them felt pointless when the core concept eluded him. They sat on the ground, weapons laid across their laps, shoulders slumped in silent frustration. Gran and Zen exchanged a look, long, wordless, full of years of shared decisions. Zen stood and walked toward them. "Gather in front of me." The boys rose and sat cross-legged before her, weapons held out. Zen knelt between them, placing one hand on Rowan's great sword and the other on Wyatt's short sword. "Watch," she said, simply. She pushed mana onto each blade. Rowan gasped. He could feel it, the sensation of mana conducted through the weapon, flowing through steel the way it flowed through his own body. But it wasn't identical. Zen's mana had a quality all its own, sharper, more structured, like threads woven into a tight pattern. Gran stepped up beside her, placing his hands on the same weapons. His mana entered the blades from a different direction, and Rowan felt the distinction immediately. His father's mana was broader, warmer, less constrained than Zen's, like comparing a river to a canal. Both reached the same destination, but the journey was entirely different. Rowan closed his eyes, focusing on the sensation, trying to pass the mechanics of it. How were they doing this? How could mana be wrapped around metal and made to feel like part of the body? Wyatt's eyes went wide. "I know," he breathed. He pulled his short sword from Zen's hands, scrambled to his feet, and stepped back into the clearing. He raised the blade and pushed his mana into it with a sudden, decisive flow. The sensation hit him like lightning. He couldn't describe it any other way. The sword became part of his arm, an extension of his body that was sharp and cold, and alive with perception. He could feel the air moving through space, the ambient mana flowing around him like invisible currents. Every swing of the blade cut through both physical and magical space simultaneously, and he could feel the resistance, the flow, the shape of everything around him. Wyatt laughed, a pure, unfiltered sound of discovery. He swung the sword again and again, each cut opening his awareness a little wider, and each swing making the connection stronger. Rowan, unable to replicate the feeling after 2 days of trying, felt a spike of frustration so sharp it nearly doubled him over. He turned his head and yelled, "Can you make less noise? I'm still trying to train here. You're as excited as the neighbor's dog chasing a rabbit." Wyatt stopped mid-swing, having heard but not fully processing the words through his excitement. Then he walked over to Rowan, standing beside his parents, and reached out a finger to touch the flat of Rowan's great sword. He pushed a thread of his own mana onto the blade. "Your head is mostly muscle," Wyatt said, his voice still carrying the edge of excitement. "But you're still my brother. Think about this. The whole world contains mana. Everything touches mana. Or rather, mana touches everything. You can tell mana what to do now. You've trained it. Just tell it to make the great sword you. Rowan opened his mouth to argue. If it was that easy, he would have done it 2 days ago. But the words died in his throat. Because something had shifted. He'd done things similar in the past. He'd learned to quickly review his techniques, to analyze and adjust in real time. This was difficult and different, but it was also familiar. The pattern was there, buried under layers of habit and assumption. Rowan closed his eyes. He thought back to the first time he'd consciously diffused mana through his arms. The feeling of mana flowing from his core, through his torso, into his shoulders, down his biceps, through his forearms, and out through his hands. The progression, step by step, segment by segment. What if the great sword was just his arm? A longer arm. He moved his diffused mana through his arm, into his hands, through his fingers, and then extended it further. Past his grip, past the blade's balance point, down the full length of the great sword. The mana resisted for a second, the steel's density pushing back against his perception. Then it yielded. The flow opened, and mana poured down the blade like water finding its level. The great sword became part of his body, just as real as his own limbs. Rowan pulled the sword back from his parents' hands and swung. The heavy swoosh of steel cutting through air and ambient mana simultaneously sent a thrill through him that no punch or kick had ever produced. The blade felt like his arm, heavier, yes, but his. Every point of contact, every angle of approach, was mapped in his perception with crystal clarity. Woo! The sound tore out of him before he could stop it, and he didn't care. Rowan turned to Wyatt, a grin splitting his face. Well, brother, that brain of yours is good for something. I'll acknowledge it. Wyatt's grin was brighter than the forge fire. Don't get used to it. Behind them, Sen and Gran looked at each other across their sons' shoulders. No words passed between them. None were needed. The chord had found its next note.